Welcome everyone to CALL's monthly learning meeting. Today the topic is on plastics and we're very excited to have a guest speaker here from Environmental Defense. That's Karen Wirsig, and she's going to give us an excellent presentation on plastics, and the topic being tackling the pollution crisis and the climate threat. Karen is the plastics expert from Environmental Defense and our featured speaker. She'll help us to understand how we can better protect wildlife, our environment, and our health by stopping plastic waste from piling up all around us, and also see the connection between climate change and the failure of our current waste reduction and recycling systems. Karen is the Plastics Program Manager at Environmental Defense, and she's working on a global plastics treaty, as well as proposed single-use plastics legislation, to name a few of her focused initiatives. Karen has worked as a journalist and as a labor and community organizer, and is passionate about getting plastics out of the environment. Her informed yet practical approach to understanding this subject will appeal to everyone who is concerned about this ever-growing global plastics pollution crisis, and we are so happy to welcome her today. Karen, over to you.
So I'm really happy to be here today. I'm also really happy to talk to you about plastics and the link between plastics and climate change, which is something that I've been developing through questions I've been getting actually since I started as the plastics program manager at Environmental Defense. I think for a long time, the two issues of climate change and plastics were seen as separate pollution problems, but actually they're very, very, very much entwined. And so I'm really happy to kind of help talk through that and lay that out today. So just a little bit on environmental defense in case you don't know. It's environmental defense was founded in the 1980s. We call ourselves a leading Canadian environmental advocacy organization. We have tens of thousands of supporters who take action to defend the environment all the time. And we're nonpartisan, we're fact-based, and we're a collaborative organization. We work with lots of other groups across the country and local groups. I think maybe some of this group would know environmental defense from being one of the main organizations that helps ensure the creation and the protection of the green belt in the Greater Toronto Golden Horseshoe area. Very active on that and continuing today on that point. Our plastics program is much more recent. It started sort of in the mid 2010s, and I'm about the third person who's worked on it, and I really am very grateful to all the colleagues who came before me and who've really developed a fantastic body of knowledge and body of policy to try to deal with this really persistent problem. So what is plastic? And why are we swimming in it? As we note, whenever we go to any kind of public waterway or beach or lake, we notice there's often lots of plastic around us. Plastic is one of the most, it's one of the most ubiquitous materials we deal with. It's kind of an intimate part of our lives at this point. But it's also a series of chemicals, polymers, that are held together. And so plastic, maybe the easiest thing to say is plastic is a lot of things. And sometimes it's a confusing thing. So hopefully we'll get to the bottom of it. And I should mention that I'm happy if people have questions for clarification. I think the organizers, Karen and Caroline, have asked people to put questions in the chat. But if there's really something that you're stumped with and you can't get the question to the chat, feel free to raise your hand, and I'm happy to stop at any time and go back and take questions of clarification, because again, it's not that complex, but it is a confusing thing. We have plastic all around us, but we hardly know what it is. So I like to start with plastics by the numbers because it just gives you a sense, and we will come back to the whole industry side of things. But plastics and really the petrochemical industry that plastics is a key part of is a $4 trillion global industry. So it's a massive global industry. It's part of a massive global industry that is highly, highly concentrated, meaning there are relatively few players in the global petrochemical industry, which means that there's relatively few players that have a lot of power. In Canada, it's about a $40 billion industry here, just in Canada alone. And what does that mean in terms of our everyday lives and our environment? Well, we create about 4.4 million tons of plastic that gets thrown away every year. And of that, only about 8% gets recycled. So what that translates into is that more than 11,000 tons of plastic goes into landfills, incinerators, and the environment every day in Canada. So just to give you a sense of what 11,000 tons is, I looked it up on Google. I said, what weighs 11 tons? And they told me that 7 sedans weigh 11 tons. So just picture 7 kind of mid-sized cars. That's what we toss into in this country, incinerators, landfills, and the natural environment every day. 7 sedans. It's quite significant. Or the equivalent weight. And remember how lightweight plastic is. So it's a lot of plastic. I'll leave this slide here for a second, and because there's a lot to say about it. The plastics industry in the 80s decided that to help recycling along, it would actually label plastic items with codes that were allegedly there to tell recyclers what kind of plastic an item is made out of. And now you'll see those on the bottom of your, of plastic packaging or other plastics that you use every day. You might see these symbols. Typically they're on packaging. They're not often on other things, but typically they're on packaging and stuff. And so what you see is the numbers at the top of the screen with arrows around them. And those arrows were frankly designed by the industry to be confused with the recycling symbol. So when we see these arrows with numbers in the middle, we now are trained to think, oh, that means it's recycled. And in fact, that's not the case. And I can get into the recycling numbers a little bit later. And in fact, recycling depends on whether it's recyclable or not, depends on a lot of factors, including whether it's collected in a state that is fit for recycling, so not contaminated and not mixed with contaminants, but also what kind of a plastic it is. And so this is the list of polymer types. And I mean, I'm going to move off the slide now, but we'll come back to it a little bit later too. And I can always come back later if you're really curious, but just maybe before I move off, I'll just explain. Like number 1, PET, is what your soft drink and water bottles are made out of. HDPE is what number 2 is what your laundry detergent bottles are made out of. PVC is some packaging, but mostly used in things like flooring and piping and things like that. Some sheeting. It's very toxic. It's toxic to make. It's toxic as waste. And a lot of people are calling for it to just be outright banned, the use of PVC to be outright banned. Number 4, LDPE, also made out of polyethylene, and it tends to be the more flimsy plastic films, trash bags, 6-pack rings, the stuff that's more flexible. Polypropylene is common. It's actually used commonly in reusable plastic containers because you can make it, it's flexible but a rigid container that can be reused many times. Polystyrene is that sort of styrofoam stuff we all know and love, that blows away into nature and finds its way into, onto beaches very easily. Animals eat it. It's another one that we'd like to see banned outright. And then there's the fancy other category, because just to be clear, plastic, there are so many different types of polymers, but also additives that make plastics different. So it's, you have to really be a chemist to know exactly what all these plastics are. And so there's this other category that I will tell you nobody recycles. Nobody collects it for recycling and nobody recycles it. So, and a bunch of packaging is actually made out of it. So maybe on the more mundane side, everyday plastics, their packaging, as we know, other single-use products like cutlery or straws or balloons. A lot of our clothing is now made out of plastic or partly out of plastic, polyesters and other synthetic fibers. Lots of toys, as we know, are made out of plastic. Furnishings, including carpets, laminated flooring and laminates on our cupboards and countertops, tables, chairs, all kinds of furniture. And other kinds of fibers that are used in our houses. Electronics, of course, computer and phone cases. My keyboard here is made out of plastic. My computer stand's made out of plastic. I'm sure you're all looking at a lot of plastic items right now. And then car parts are made out of, a lot of car parts, increasingly car parts and other transportation parts are made out of plastic. So we have this plastic all around us. The industry sold us on the idea that starting in the 70s, when people noticed, wow, there's a lot of plastic, more and more plastic being used, what's happening to it? And, you know, scientists would tell people back in the day, you'll remember this, that it doesn't break down. You know, once you throw a plastic bottle in a landfill, you'll find that plastic bottle, you know, hundreds of years later. It does not break down. So what are we going to do with all this plastic? At the time, the plastics industry said, oh, we'll recycle it. It's no problem. We'll recycle this plastic. And first they had to convince us that you can throw this stuff away. It's so cheap and cheerful that you can use it once and throw it away and start fresh. What an amazing thing. And they did, you know, in the industry in the 50s and 60s, did ad campaigns to convince mainly women to throw the stuff away after using it once. So this is sort of a trained behavior that we began to adopt in the middle of the 20th century and has continued to this day, this idea that we can use this plastic once and throw it away. And the promise of recycling was that it's fine, we can use these things, throw them away, they'll be recycled, we'll make them again. But what we know is around the world, less than 10% of, and since the beginning of plastic production, and recycling, less than 10% of all plastic ever made has been recycled. And in Canada, what we know from recent StatsCan data is that only 8% of the plastic put on the market every year is pelletized and turned back into another plastic product. So this is what we call the recycling myth, is really what we call greenwashing from the industry. There is a place for plastics recycling for sure, but it is not going to be the answer to the plastics crisis that we're in now. So I can go into a little bit more detail on that. First of all, it's useful to look at what is recycling. And you know, recycling's been around for a long time. We know that you can recycle paper, you can recycle glass, you can recycle metal, and you can recycle certain plastics. So it's a way of reusing resources over and over again to avoid having to extract them again from the earth, right? And so this is a little infographic we did just to explain it. I hope it's big enough for you to see. Feel free to get closer to your screen. I'm sorry, this is the biggest I could get, this particular one. So, you know, you have wood, you have trees that get turned into pulp, that get turned into paper products or cardboard products. And you can see there's emissions involved at every step of that process, right? And then you put them into your recycling bin, they get recycled and they hopefully get turned back into paper, so that reduces the need for, you know, cutting down virgin forest, right? You have in the next row down bauxite, which is a factor in aluminum production. You take the bauxite to a smelter, out comes aluminum bars. Those get turned into aluminum products, like, for example, cans, beer cans. Those get put into a recycling bin and turned back into beer cans. And that's a fairly successful, like you can basically turn almost the whole can back into a can. So that's a fairly successful form of recycling. I think the one problem is that when the cans are lined sometimes now with plastic, there are a lot of emissions when you're recycling those cans. So that is a problem that has to be addressed, but the aluminum itself is eminently recyclable. And then the last one is glass, and glass comes from sand and aggregate, and that gets basically put into a big kiln and turned into glass with a few other elements, obviously. And it gets turned into glass products. Again, those should be recyclable. Unfortunately, a lot of the glass that we toss into our bins right now gets smashed down and doesn't get turned back into glass containers, unfortunately. So in each of these cases, the quality of the recycling depends a little bit on how we collect it, whether it's properly collected and given to a processor in a way that it could be reprocessed into the same thing. And to be honest, that isn't always that successful in our current system. And it's especially not successful for plastic. So plastic recycling, after 40 years of trying, only 9% of plastic waste is recycled, or less than 9% of plastic waste is recycled in Canada each year. In fact, it's like 8% of what's put on the market is actually made into pellets that can be turned back into another product. There's about that 1% is lost. 9% is sent to the processors, and then about 1% is lost in the processing. So this is years and years of trying, like basically my whole lifetime of trying. We've never gotten there, right? The most likely plastic packaging to be recycled is bottles. And so that was that number one, PET, which is kind of drinks containers, and sometimes liquid detergent is in PET, and things like on the number two, that HDPE, the laundry detergent containers, and those kinds of rigid bottles. Those can be recycled, especially if they're white or clear. And when those are collected in the blue box, you can imagine when you're putting stuff in your blue box, those bottles are easy to sort out, right? They have a certain shape, they're heavy, they're easy to recognize. Even if you have a human sorter or an optical sorter, you can get those out. They're heavier than films, so they fall to the bottom. Like there are ways that it's easier to get those kind of bottles out. Those get put into bales and sent to basically from these sorting facilities to the highest bidder. Often the highest bidder will be somewhere in Ontario, if we're selling it from here, or sometimes in the United States. Like a lot of the PET goes to the United States. But I went through the StatsCan data just for this presentation because it's new data, and it was really interesting. I'm really glad I did it, so thank you for for the reason to take the time to do that. 82% of all plastic recycling comes from these rigid bottles. So of all of the 4.4 million tons of plastic that is put on the market every year in Canada, discarded 4.4 million is discarded every year in Canada, 82% of the recyclate that comes from that is just those bottles that are mainly collected in our blue bins or collected through a deposit return system. So, and really deposit return is the best way. The least likely post-consumer plastic, the stuff we use at home, to be recycled is the films. And that's only it's more than half of all packaging, but it's only 13% of the recyclate, the stuff that then can be further made into new plastics. Only 3% of films are recycled. And so really that's a very low number. And you can, it's quite logical, right? When you think about it, if those things that are in our blue boxes, it's hard to sort out that plastic film. It acts like paper. And in a minute, we're going to see what it means for those plastic films to act like paper in our blue boxes. There's a very tragic result of that. And in fact, many municipal programs say they don't take films. And films are increasingly being used as a sort of a lightweighting strategy. 91% of plastic isn't recycled. I'm just going to get through the end of this infographic, just so you can see where plastic comes from. It's oil and gas, it gets turned into pellets, it gets turned into plastic products, and then most of it is sent to landfill. Some of it, and especially the drink containers on a deposit return, are the ones that get put into bales for further processing and recycling. This question of lightweighting, there's a climate connection to this. If you use lighter weight plastic, it's less weight to transport around. So, you might have a heavier detergent bottle, you turn that into a pouch, suddenly, the claim is, oh, it's lighter weight, so it's better for the planet. But you want to look at those claims a little bit. This is a pouch I bought at home as a refill. And I actually bought this pouch before I started working on plastics, when I was more likely to look at labels and think, oh, well, maybe that's right. I don't know. So what it says here on this pouch, and this is, I took these photos, so sorry, they're not fantastic, but I've sort of pulled out the quotes that I thought were interesting. This refill uses 80% less plastic than 3 new bottles. So the idea is you buy a little bottle, and then when that runs out, you keep that rigid bottle, that kind of more heavy duty bottle with the pumper, and you buy these plastic pouches to refill that pumper. 3 times. I can tell you the film pouch is never going to be recycled. It's off. I think these pouches are laminated, meaning they're made with layered plastics of different types of polymers. It's hugely expensive to try to process those things, and the value that you get out of them is not.
Someone is just asking, what do you mean by films when you say films?
Oh, sure. Okay. So films, plastic films are those flexible, flimsy kind of, you might, saran wrap is a classic, the original film, saran wrap, invented by Dow Chemical in the 50s. And that's a type of film. These pouches we call films because they're flexible. Some films are single polymers, like a lot of films would be polyethylene, low density polyethylene, but some are also multiple polymers stuck together, like in the case of this pouch, I believe that's the case. The other thing is you'll see that cap at the top is not film, it's a different kind of plastic altogether that is mixed in with the film. So this kind of pouch has mixed plastic all over the place. It's 100% not recyclable. The city of Toronto, if you live in Toronto, will tell you, do not put this in your blue box, although I did for years not knowing. And you can only use the pouch once. So 100%, you're going to buy this pouch, you're going to refill your little thingy 3 times, and then it's going to go into landfill, right? So they say it uses less plastic than 3 new bottles. But if it were a true reuse system, I would buy 1 bottle and use it for years and years. And instead, I'm buying a bottle and then I'm buying a pouch that I throw away, I don't know, once every 6 months or something. So what kind of solution really is that when we're talking about plastic waste? It isn't one. Yeah, plastic bags, grocery bags, garbage bags, those are all made out of films as well. We're going to see a little clip from a recent Fifth Estate documentary. Fifth Estate is CBC's documentary program. We're going to see a recent clip, a clip from a recent video about what is happening to Canada's, some of Canada's plastic waste. And it's not a happy story, but it's really important that we all see that.
Dirty little secret number 2. Last fall, colleagues at the Radio-Canada program Enquête got a tip that Canadian plastic waste was being shipped around the world to places like India. And that is where their investigation began.
We now shift our focus to the Indian capital, where more than 20 million people continue to breathe in toxic air.
3 hours outside India's capital is the city of Muzaffarnagar, the center of India's paper recycling industry. Here, air looks like soup.
For the last few weeks, a thick blanket of smog had residents complaining of allergies, watery eyes, and even respiratory illnesses.
But the smog from Muzaffarnagar's more than 30 mills is not just the result of recycling paper. Hidden among the bales of paper the mills import is plastic waste. A little bit of plastic is permissible, but here our colleagues found mountains of it that had a very Canadian feel.
Pour hommes et femmes.
A clothing store bag from Quebec City. Another from Indigo. Cat food packaging with the label President's Choice.
Ah non, c'est de la nourriture pour chat, the President's Choice.
Plastic milk bags, so common in much of Canada, were everywhere.
Et qu'on reconnaît facilement, le lait qui est bon.
There was trash from Europe and the United States as well, but most of what they discovered was distressingly familiar. Even a blue recycling bag from the city of Toronto. The plastic is what's left after the mills take out the paper they recycle. Local residents are then hired to sort through the waste. People like these women.
So, can you explain to me the work that you do here? What do you do?
कचरे में करते हैं जी काम
क्या काम करते हैं आप? जैसे यहाँ आते हैं तो क्या करते हैं?
ये प्लास्टिक छुटता है जी डिबली निकालते हैं सिल्वर
Can you tell me how much you can earn every day?
200 जी
200 rupees, just over $3 a day, to separate hard plastic like bottles, which can be sold to other recyclers, from soft plastic like bags, which can't be recycled. Occasionally, there's even a souvenir, further evidence of where all that waste has come from.
This is from Canada. And this is from the United States. America. America.
America.
The women said they didn't know what happened to all the soft plastic they collected. But a guard for the mills said at least some went back to the recycling plants to be burned as fuel.
He's saying they burn it in the boiler.
Burn it in the boiler, okay.
Burning plastic is toxic, illegal in India, but it's also cheap. Which means it's not just the mills that burn it. The black smoke on the horizon is from a village that makes candy, mom and pop operations. Where once again, the team from Enquête found plastic used as fuel.
So what they do is they take wood and they take the plastic and they burn it together.
Together. Oh yeah, is this legal to burn the plastic like that with the wood? No,
कानून बता रहे मैंने
but people do it anyway.
बच्चे हैं कोई मजदूर करनी है.
So it's quite a disturbing story that the Fifth Estate is telling, and I really encourage you. I think the link to that documentary is in the resources that I sent, and I really encourage you to watch the whole thing because it's really an important way. But what you can see, that pouch of dog food that the journalist was showing is very similar to the pouch of plastic soap refiller that I showed previously on a previous picture. And I think it's really important just to remember, like when we're sending paper bales overseas to other mills, it's so expensive to sort them here properly that they just get shipped. I mean, I think this is the easiest answer, is that these bales of paper don't get properly sorted here and they get shipped. And then we depend on women earning 200 rupees a day to sort the stuff out in India. And even then, once it's sorted, you can see that all that plastic film is garbage. It's being burned illegally as fuel. It's complete garbage. It's never going to be recyclable in any way that we imagine what recycling is, as I showed you in those previous slides, where you avoid taking new resources out of the ground by making things again and again by the same primary materials. And so I think it's important to understand that, because the plastics industry is really promoting this kind of idea of recycling, understanding that these films that are used increasingly can't be, mechanically recycled or conventionally recycled in the way that we understand it. They're increasingly promoting this idea of what they call advanced or chemical recycling, which really involves thermally treating the plastic. It's a form of incineration. And what comes out the other end is a fuel that gets burned, or chemicals that can get used for any number of things, but not necessarily plastic. And it's very experimental still for use with plastic. The only commercially viable projects use heat and energy and catalysts to turn waste into fuel, waxes, lubricants, and chemicals, not ever plastic. It does not replace virgin plastic resins, what we call virgin plastic, which is the stuff that comes straight from the oil that's taken out of the ground. And it's toxic, it's expensive, it's improvement, and it obviously contributes to climate warming. And the other thing about it is that it pretends to make single-use plastics viable. That's really how the industry is pushing it. The industry is saying we can still continue to make all these single-use plastics that we use today. And if we just basically got the government to pay for all these expensive experimental facilities, we would be able to deal with our problem. So this is just an image to show you sort of our version of what we call advanced recycling. The plastic comes in as oil and gas. It gets turned in, it goes to a refinery, through a pipeline usually, it gets turned into pellets. The pellets get manufactured into some kind of plastic product like a bottle. The bottle gets thrown away, sometimes in a blue bin, sometimes in a beach, whatever. And it also gets turned into plastic bags. Some of this stuff, a very small amount actually, might get sent to an advanced recycling facility. Out of that facility, 30% by weight is probably going to be some kind of solid waste of tar and ash. Some of it might be fuel or chemicals. And if it's fuel and chemicals, it's not going to be just turned right back into these pellets like this arrow, which you would see in glass or metal or paper recycling, where you come out of the recycling facility and you go right back to pellets. What you're going to see is some of the fuel or chemicals will go back into the refinery, but be mixed with, the vast majority of what they're mixed with is freshly extracted oil and gas. So it really doesn't displace any virgin resin. It basically, what it does is it supports the continuation of the system we have today, which is to use to extract oil and gas in part to make plastic. Some plastic manufacturers also promote plastic from non-fossil fuel sources, such as plants. The problem with that is that it might be good on the climate side. It might, as I say, because some agriculture is also, extremely hard on the climate, and especially monoculture that's used for cash crops, which this surely is. But so you can have plant-sourced plastic, but in fact, most of plant-sourced polymers act no different in the waste stream or nature than regular plastic. They are the same polymers. They break down, over the same 1,000 years, and have to be treated. So they do not stop the plastic waste problem. They also contain the same additives that could be toxic. And again, they pretend to make single-use plastics viable, when really the single-use plastics are a major source of our problem. We also hear more and more about biodegradable and compostable plastics. Just a note here that, this is again, mostly greenwashing. Compostable plastics are not accepted in most municipal organics programs. So please don't put compostable plastics in your green bin, for example. I wouldn't put them in your outdoor composter if you have one either. They also then, when they go to landfill, which they do, or if they go to an incinerator, they release climate warming methane. They also, the standards for so-called compostable plastics allow for microplastic particles to remain behind. So when you're composting, when it's, say, an industrial composter is composting plastics, the soil that comes out of it, or the materials that come out of it, will include microplastics that are a source of pollution. And again, the compostable single-use plastics are simply there to pretend to make single-use plastic, to make us believe that single-use plastics are viable. So these are the various greenwashing. The final one is energy from waste, and that's called incineration. It does have a bad name, I think, in large parts of North America. It's much more popular and much more used in Europe. But there are incinerators here. I don't know if you're aware, but there are 2 incinerators in the city of Brampton, which is a bit shocking because I don't think there's any other municipality across Canada that has 2. And incineration is sometimes called recycling because you can basically, in some incinerators have, are connected to turbines that generate some electricity, steam for some electricity that goes back into the grid. But it is worth noting that the energy recovered from burning plastics offsets less than 20% of the energy needed to make the virgin plastics in the first place. So basically, it's a highly, highly polluting and ineffective way of creating fuel. It's not a clean fuel, even though in Ontario, it is currently identified and defined as a clean fuel, as an alternative fuel. Incinerators emit more air pollutants than coal-fired power plants, and they're also a key source of carcinogenic dioxins and furans. The other problem with incinerators is they're greedy for waste. So if most municipalities say we have a waste reduction plan, we'd like to reduce waste. Once you build an incinerator, it's expensive to build, and you need to keep supplying it with waste. In fact, the city of Edmonton has has done a deal with a private company for a form of incineration that's called gasification. And they are required for the next 20 years to provide 100,000 tons of waste to that incinerator every year. And in a public report, they've said that does limit their ability to do waste reduction strategies, because if they don't give the waste, they'll have to pay the money. Again, incineration is used as a strategy to make single-use plastic seem viable. So I think I've mentioned this a few times. 99% of plastic is made from fossil fuels. on the sort of the positive side of the ledger, the plastics are cheap. And I think it's important to note that plastics in part are cheap because fossil fuel extraction is so heavily subsidized. And all of the infrastructure required, including the pipelines, are so heavily subsidized. They're often on indigenous lands. The pipelines, as we know, go through indigenous lands. This is the reality of fossil fuel extraction, and the pollution from the extraction goes through indigenous lands. Like, this is the cost of this cheap plastic. Plastics are flexible, they're convenient, especially for packagers. They're very convenient, often more so than other forms of packaging, and they're lightweight, so they're cheap and frankly energy efficient to transport. On the other side, though, they contribute to climate change without a doubt, and we'll get into more detail on that in a minute. They contain toxic additives. They're deadly to wildlife when they end up in their plastic form, in both microplastic and macroplastic form in nature. And as the federal government has determined, they are harmful to the environment. And let's not forget that we throw away the equivalent of 7 sedans or 11 tons of plastic every day into landfills, incinerators, and the natural environment. So I guess the World Wildlife published this stat last year. If plastics were a country, it would be the 5th highest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. So just to put it into perspective, that's how much plastics around the world, that for the full life cycle, from extraction to production to disposal. That's how big we're talking. So bigger, bigger than Canada for sure. And we're not a small emitter, even though we're a fairly small population. Petrochemicals, of which plastic is the major part, together with things like fertilizers and other chemicals used in pharmaceuticals. Petrochemicals are the 3rd largest industrial emitter of greenhouse gases worldwide. That's after energy and transportation, just by the way. In 2020, petrochemicals represented approximately 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's the equivalent of 5.6 gigatons of CO2 emissions. And the life cycle impacts of this sector are not well understood. So climate action is more focused on energy and transportation. And we've even heard some climate scientists suggest that plastics is maybe a good carbon sink when they extract. And just so that we understand the process, when they're extracting oil and gas from the ground, some of the, like methane and some of these other gases, are just seen as waste products that get released into the atmosphere. If they capture some of those waste products, they can turn them into things like plastics. But by doing that, you're assuming the continued extraction of petrochemicals fossil fuels for other purposes. And the other thing is, you're also just delaying the inevitable, that at some point that plastic is going to be, as soon as you make it, it's going to start to break down. And over time, it will also release those same, the methane and other chemicals that warm the atmosphere and do other things to the environment, as we know. So I think it's really just important to note that petrochemicals are a really big part of the climate problem. In the US, a report came out at the end of last year called "Plastics is the New Coal." And as climate activists, I'm sure you all know that coal is really the dirtiest word in fossil fuels. So I think this group in the US, Beyond Plastics, made an important contribution to the debate, suggesting that plastics is responsible for 232 million tons, the US type tons, of CO2 emissions per year in the US. And that's the equivalent emissions of 116 average sized coal-fired power plants, if you can imagine. So that's a significant number of emissions. This slide, one of my climate colleagues gave this to me last year, and I think it shows, I think it's important just to know the red line at the top is what countries, including Canada, are projecting in terms of fossil fuel production, which includes plastics, between now and 2050. And so that's the red line at the top, and the purplish line at the bottom is production that's consistent with global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is what the world has said we want to try to aim for. So we're still making we're producing an enormous amount of fossil fuels, and we don't really have plans. Even the production implied by the climate pledges, which is the brown line just below the red, will not get us to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? And I just wanted to show you in this slide what petrochemicals, what accounts, or the extent to which petrochemicals accounts for that growth in demand of oil and gas between 2017 and 2030. And you can see that it's the biggest single source in growth in demand is petrochemicals. So plastics, again, very big part of the story. If trends continue, plastic production will generate 17% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. As you know, as we decarbonize energy and transportation, if we continue with the petrochemical production that we're seeing and the growth every year, year over year, petrochemical and plastics production, this is where we'll be, 17% of all emissions by 2050. So what's going on? Why? We all are trying to figure out what's better plastic. How do we stop this? What's the problem? How dumb are we that we, can't use our blue box properly? Like, we must be the problem. This is the point in the presentation where I say this is not your fault. This is, sure, individually we should probably buy less. We should probably avoid single use where we can, but we live in a society in which big oil and big plastic, as we know, have a lot of power. And big plastic likes to supply us with plastic. And so what we have is a supply problem, at least as much as a demand problem. Just so you understand a little bit the political economy of plastics in Canada, 3 companies make virtually all of the plastic polymer produced in Canada. Nova Chemicals, which started out actually as part of an Alberta Crown Corporation in I can't even remember when it started. I think it started in the 60s and was privatized in the 80s and 90s and bought up in the late 90s or early 2000s by an investment arm of the Abu Dhabi government, which produces oil in its own right. So Nova Chemicals is not an oil and gas producer, but it takes oil and gas in Sarnia and in Alberta. It takes the byproducts of oil and gas production to make chemicals, and their most profitable arm, of course, is plastics production. Dow Chemical, has everybody heard of Dow Chemical? It's like the devil US-based multinational petrochemical and chemicals producer. It's known for the breast implants that caused cancer. It invented polystyrene, the styrofoam, it invented saran wrap. It makes chemicals and it's hidden sort of the effects, DDT, it's hidden the effects of these chemicals. So that's one of Canada's biggest plastic producers, Dow Chemical. And then Imperial Oil, which is now majority owned by ExxonMobil, which is based in the US. Imperial Oil is nominally a Canadian company, but the majority shareholder is this US-based company, ExxonMobil, which is a known climate denier. So those 3 companies make virtually all the plastic in Canada. They make polyethylene, which is sourced from ethane gas that comes from oil sands and natural gas production in Alberta and from fracking in Ohio and Pennsylvania, which then gets piped into Sarnia. They're suing, some of it also frankly gets piped into Sarnia from out west as well, but that's the source of the polyethylene. Those 3 companies are suing the federal government to try to stop the regulation of plastics as a pollutant under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And we'll talk in a few minutes about why that's so important. Just a reminder about what polyethylene is. This is from the United Nations Environment Program from a report last year. Polyethylene is the most discarded synthetic polymer. So it's really the source of a lot of single-use plastics. It's used in shopping bags. It's the highest emitter of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas, and ethylene, which reacts with hydroxide in the atmosphere to increase the concentrations of carbon monoxide. So that's our friend polyethylene. And that's really the only plastic polymer that's produced in Canada in its original form. And just a reminder, this is a little going back to that chart from before about what polyethylene is. So it's used in bread bags, paper towels and tissue, overwrap, like, you know, that kind of overwrap you see around 6-packs or whatever else, squeeze bottles, trash bags, and 6-pack rings. That's what polyethylene is. Some of the things that polyethylene is made into. You can see the pictures there. And just again, a reminder about low density polyethylene. It's the most common form of packaging. It's often littered and it's the least likely to be recycled. So just before we end, I just wanted to take a few minutes on the heavy toll that all of this fossil fuel production and petrochemical and plastic production takes on the environment, but also on the communities that are most affected by extraction and production of plastics. First, and this is a report, this image is from a report that was just released by Environmental Defense and my colleagues last week about the toxic tailing ponds in the Alberta oil sands that are mostly concentrated north of Fort McMurray. And what you see on this map here is Fort McKay at the bottom, which is again about 100 kilometers north of Fort McMurray, which is itself about 200 kilometers north of Edmonton. And the kind of sandy yellow boxes, the dark boxes surrounded by sandy yellow here at the bottom, what you see here are the tailings ponds. And Indigenous peoples have noticed that who live along this Athabasca River, which runs up into the Athabasca Lake near Fort Chipewyan. What Indigenous peoples have noticed is that the water is obviously dirty and they're being exposed to poisons and it's affecting their health from these massive tailings ponds. The problem is that the industry would like to release the full weight of the tailings ponds into the river and let it wash away up north. And, you know, the problem, of course, is that the communities are already noticing the effects of just the small leaks and are very concerned about the impact on their health and on the whole overall environment in northern Alberta and into Northwest Territories of the release of these tailings ponds. So our campaign is working to try to stop the release of those tailings ponds and to require the companies to take care of that problem. The Denisolee living in Fort McKay described being fenced in by industry. And I think this map, this part here at the bottom shows what you mean. People live in here and they're literally fenced in by industry and by toxic tailings. So there's the front end of the life cycle of plastics, the extraction portion. Here you have refining in Sarnia. Have people heard of the term Chemical Valley? Sarnia is known as Chemical Valley. It's actually the site of the first oil well in the world, I understand. It had, you know, Sarnia has natural occurring oil deposits itself. Petrolia is near there, that Indigenous peoples knew over the years that like oil would sort of bubble up to the ground. And so it's very close to the surface there. Imperial, Exxon, and Nova both produce together about 1 million tons of polyethylene in that Sarnia area every year. The Imperial refinery is on land that was given away from the local Indigenous community, the Aamjiwnaang community, to the Imperial predecessor back in the late 19th century. So they're literally on Indigenous land, treaty lands that was given away. And this Aamjiwnaang community is exposed to benzene releases and leaks that are documented, which of course increase the community's cancer risks. And there is a higher, I mean, of course, nobody will confirm it, but there is, nobody will confirm the source of it. Nobody in official circles, but of course there is a higher rate of cancer in Sarnia and Aamjiwnaang than in other parts of Southern Ontario. And then just because many of us here are from Toronto, I thought I should also talk about the Green Lane landfill, which is the City of Toronto owned landfill down southwest of London, Ontario. It's a neighbor, it's right beside, not surprisingly, when we think about where these things get sited, the Oneida of the Thames First Nations and the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation. Both of them are in the neighborhood. And the neighboring Oneida have complained of fumes from the landfill and say that the Oneida was not consulted by the City of Toronto about the landfill and only became aware of it after reading about it in a newspaper. So when this was raised, this is in the mid-2000s, when this was raised, there was a deal that was struck between the two, between the City of Toronto and the Oneida of the Thames First Nation. But the Oneida continues to say that the city has not lived up to its side of the bargain. And, you know, the fumes and sicknesses that the community complains about can be traced back to plastics, because what basically one of the reasons we send so much waste to landfill is that plastics can, as we noted before, contaminates the recycling stream, right? So you can get plastics that are contaminating the recycling stream, like all that flimsy stuff that can't be recycled and is mixed in with other things. It contaminates the food waste stream, which would otherwise not go to landfill, but would go to a composting facility or a form of composting facility. And so really what we see is that plastic helps drive the amount of waste that ends up going to landfill, and that creates all these fumes and then methane releases, et cetera. So just worth keeping in mind, this is our City of Toronto landfill here. So obviously what we're interested in is making polluters responsible. So upstream at the tailings ponds, to clean up the tailings ponds and the orphan wells, and eliminate upstream also, from an upstream perspective, to eliminate single-use products and packaging and provide reuse options, which would reduce our need for single-use plastics and throwaway plastics. And downstream, meaning further along in the life cycle of plastics, we do support extended producer responsibility for collecting and repairing, reusing and recycling discarded products and packaging. And extended producer responsibility is a type of system that's being introduced in many jurisdictions, including Ontario, that basically says, you know, we're taking away the responsibility for this type of waste from the municipalities, and we're 100% handing it over to the businesses that create it. So, you know, your Loblaws and other grocery stores, electronics and other consumer goods stores will now be responsible for the stuff that ends up in the blue bin. They'll be responsible for collecting it, and they're supposed to be held to high targets of recycling it, although not high enough. Obviously, the wish would be that we recycle all the plastic we use. They will only be required by 2030 to recycle 60% of the rigid plastics and 40% of the films. So you can imagine that at least half of the plastic that we use today would still end up in landfill or incinerators, even with these high recycling targets. So what we're saying is federally, at all levels of government, we need to make companies responsible for all of the discarded products and packaging in both the stuff that comes from households, and right now everything that comes from, say, the mall or the hospital is not monitored really at all. We don't even know what happens to it, but most of it does end up in landfill. Some of it is also exported. So we need to ensure companies are responsible for all of this waste. We need to require reuse systems at every level of government. There needs to be reuse required. We need to require recycling at the end of life of the product to package. If it's not recyclable, it shouldn't be made. We need to require transparent reporting, so we actually know what's happening to this stuff. It's really hard to know right now what's happening. And you know, when the Fifth Estate did that documentary about the waste going to India, like, we knew the reason we found out about it is because somebody stopped the shipment in Belgium, not in Canada, in Belgium. So we have a very untransparent system of dealing with waste in this country. We need to ban packaging and organics from landfills and incinerators, and we need to enforce requirements and impose high penalties for violations. And what we're asking the federal government to do specifically, because we believe that plastic pollution, is a big problem that requires a federal response. We need the federal government to defend its right to regulate plastics. And so to defend itself against the big plastic lawsuit that's trying to stop its ability to regulate. We need to implement bans on single-use items without delay, and the federal government is expected to introduce final regulations to ban some single-use items in June. We're very much looking forward to that. But of course, those bans won't be enough. We're going to need to do more. We're going to require, we need the federal government to require new plastic products to contain a significant amount of recycled material, and these have to be safe materials, so that, elimination of additives that are problematic in recycling. We're going to have to require and support reuse of packaging. And finally, reject false solutions, including all those false solutions I laid out before, like the projects to turn plastic into fuel, or this idea that we can just replace certain single-use plastics with other types of plastics like compostable or biodegradable. You can write to the Prime Minister and Stephen Guilbeault to, just even today, it's a quick thing. There's a letter there. You're even welcome to edit it if you like, and then send it off. And just, it helps confirm to the federal government that they're on the right track with having a plan on plastics, and that they should do more than they've already planned. So that's the idea of that letter. One of the easiest things they could do, and the best things they could do, is expand deposit return on beverage containers to all types of beverages, not just beer and wine and other alcohol containers. So just something to keep in mind, to talk to your MPP about, your newly elected MPP about after the election tomorrow.
Okay, so here we're going to make these available for everyone. These were all provided by Karen, so thank you. The Center for International Environmental Law, they have a paper that's a good primer. There's a plastics blog that we can promote for Karen that I think a lot of people are going to want to look at after today, and their Mythbuster, which she talked about some of them, but somewhere we can go and go back again. The call to action to end plastic pollution, signed by more than 50 environmental organizations and delivered to the federal government. And hopefully that's part of the legislation Karen mentioned is coming out in June. The Toronto Environmental Alliance, they're advocating for a reuse refill policy. The gist that I'm getting is that people want to know what they can do individually. Understanding what you're saying is this is a bigger problem that needs advocacy and government and industry and pressure on industry. But I am hearing that people are wanting to know they could do more things themselves. But on the advocacy side, what do you suggest people do?
Well, I think talking to your local politicians for sure, and making sure that you're putting climate change and plastic pollution, making sure that stays high on their list. I think it's clear that climate change is there. What I know is that plastic pollution is something that, what I heard from federal government officials is that when they've made announcements on plastic, they're the most popular things on combating plastics. It's the most popular announcements they've ever made. They've had the most engagement on social media, the most favorable response. But we need to keep reminding them, because the pressure in our everyday life and from industry is to push back against action on plastics. Again, it's cheap, it's cheerful, it's convenient, and it's kind of become our way of life. And so this will require, I think doing this right does require some economic and systemic changes that will allow, for example, us to get off of single-use products and packaging. We'll need right to repair legislation, which the federal government has promised and the Quebec government is implementing. That means we don't have to just throw away our phones and electronics, because the battery dies, right? Like that we'll be able to get in and repair these things and not throw away not just the plastic casings, but all the precious metals that are, that are used to make the chips and the batteries, right? So, these kinds of systemic changes, we do need them. And here is a group of active people who probably are in touch with your politicians. Just with your local representatives, make sure they know, even also at the municipal level, that you care about the stuff, that you want to see reuse systems and that you would use them. Like a lot of us grew up using them. It's not some foreign concept to us. It's not some alien thing that comes from outer space. This is like a real thing. We used to do it more. We can do it again, right? Make sure they know, even also at the municipal level, that you care about the stuff, that you want to see reuse systems and that you would use them. Like a lot of us grew up using them. It's not some foreign concept to us. It's not some alien thing that comes from outer space. This is like a real thing. We used to do it more. We can do it again, right?
Thank you. Going back to the example of the pouch and the bottle of liquid soap, what can we do now to be environmentally friendly when we buy these products?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the most important, we have to think of ourselves in this case as citizens as much as consumers. So the most important thing we have to work for is a system that doesn't allow that kind of greenwashing to happen, and that really provides us real options for using less plastic packaging, which frankly, we don't really have good options for that right now. So I think ideally what would happen is you'd have your container and you'd take it and you'd refill it. So you'd bring your container back empty and you'd refill it and bring it home. Right now, you can do that in a few stores in Toronto, but it's not very convenient. So that should be much more convenient. The other thing is deposit return on containers like that, so that you would, you'd use a container for something, say a detergent or beverage or whatever you need a container for. You would return that container on deposit the way we do with beer and wine bottles right now. And those bottles would be cleaned and refilled and sold back to us on deposit. So those would be things I think we have to push for in packaging. You know, if you're really committed, I think you do want to figure out what you can reuse and what you can, when you're shopping, if you can avoid plastic packaging. But really, this is not something I encourage you to feel guilty about. Like, it's almost impossible to avoid plastic and live in this society. It really is.
I'm wondering if the USMCA is going to impinge upon the federal government's ability to defend itself in this lawsuit about restricting plastics.
Yeah, so the CUSMA, Canada, US, Mexico Free Trade Agreement, which is the new NAFTA, I guess, is being used by those companies in that lawsuit right now to say, oh, because of trade rules, we don't think Canada can regulate plastic. Oh, yeah, we trade in plastic. And it's very true that a lot of plastic crosses the border between Canada and the US at all phases of the life cycle. We export polymers, we import polymers, we export plastic products, we import plastic products, we export waste, we import waste. Like literally, plastic is crossing the border all the time. So it's true that there's a lot of connection between the two countries. What I would say is that there is nothing in any free trade agreement that stops a country from regulating, including CUSMA, that stops a country from regulating environmental protections. And we are intervening actually in that lawsuit, and we'll certainly be making that case that obviously the government has the right to regulate in the public interest on plastics. Plastics are a toxin to the environment, that has been demonstrated, and the government has not only the right and the role, but also the obligation to protect us from plastic pollution.
I am a volunteer with a grassroots organization called Stop Plastics. And at a lot of events, we table on alternatives to plastic. And Margot pointed out that there is an alternative laundry soap. This is it. You can also use it as a dish soap. And there are many, many options available. And I encourage people, when you go grocery shopping, to imagine that any plastic you bring into your home, you have to keep in your backyard or your balcony or your closet. And that certainly, I think, works as a deterrent. If you're looking at those beautiful cherry tomatoes, think about whether or not you want to keep that plastic container, or decide whether or not you're happy to cut up a tomato. There are lots of alternatives. And when you're shopping and you need clothes pegs, buy wood ones, not plastic ones. We need to go back to glass, cardboard, paper, tin, or alternatively, no packaging. That's the best. Anyway, that's my thing. Check out Stop Plastics. We've got lots of good posts and wonderful ideas and beach cleanups.
I'm wondering what happened to the program that Loblaws was initiating. I was very excited to read about the pilot project where they were going to have reusable containers. And I think there were certain companies like Haagen-Dazs and Lever Brothers where you could, pay a certain fee and then bring the container home, you would use it and then bring it back. And I also, believe that, it used to be reduce, reuse, and recycle, I believe was at the bottom of the priority. And so, the reusing, I think, is really critical. Do you have any information on that program, Karen?
Yes, I do. I just, can I say thanks to Stop Plastics, because they signed on to our letter of action to the federal government that was signed by more than 50 groups across the country that included some of these recommendations that we've made. So I'm aware of Stop Plastics and really happy that it exists. In terms of the Loop pilot, in theory, reuse is great. I'm not sure that model is going to get us there. It seemed, here are the problems that I saw with it, and I haven't seen it anywhere. Like I actually go to a local Loblaws. I've never seen it on offer, so I'm not sure how widespread it is. The idea was you would basically pay extra for a product because it had a reusable container. I think you collect all these containers in your home and then mail them somewhere to be refilled. And I think, so the problem is it's a very small scale pilot. You're mailing some of this stuff to like Ohio or something. And so it's not, because our supply chains on food continue to be so long and big, they're not refilling the stuff here. This is really what happened to pop bottles too, right? Like we used to have glass pop bottles that would be taken back on deposit and refilled. We all remember those days, right? What ended up happening is Coca-Cola decided it was cheaper for them to take back control over bottling instead of having these local bottlers, and to have, a few very massive bottling plants using plastic bottles that would just go one way. And then, you buy the plastic bottle, you're responsible for it later, or your municipality, or the environment, frankly. So this is kind of the problem with our food system right now, is that everything is, or many things are on such a big scale. They're produced all over North America and shipped to us, that already packaged, that reuse in that context doesn't work that well. So I think to be honest, what some of the big retailers are now looking at is bulk provisions that could be packaged locally, including just packaged right in the store. Like, this refillery idea, the bulk barn idea, but on a bigger scale for many more types of products. So I think some of the big retailers are actually working on that. And I think it would be a much more effective and convenient and accessible system than what Loop is trying with Loblaws.
Okay, so I have a friend who lives in the north of Scotland. I just wanted to say that she was in a project where they would count every piece of plastic that they used for a certain time. And then I guess all this is tallied up. And I don't know who put this together, but it was really important for her to do this. And I'm just wondering if there's anything like that here, any kind of project like that.
No, I'm not aware of one, but that does sound interesting. Just to sort of do a little personal audit on how much plastic we're coming across.
Yeah, it was like, I guess she had a log, or she kept a note. And then, she lives in a community, Findhorn Foundation, but I think it was bigger than that. I think it was more of a larger community operation.
Karen, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It really was one of the best ones I've seen, and I can't tell you how much I learned, but I do feel guilty, and I do feel a bit depressed, because I was feeling very good about understanding the difference, I thought, between biodegradable poo bags, which don't degrade very quickly at all, and compostable. And I thought, well, maybe this is a solution. Maybe they will degrade faster than the biodegradable. Is there any, what does one do with that? It's very hard to,
Yeah, the other thing is there aren't any standards right now for what you can call biodegradable or compostable. Yeah, I think biodegradable is not good. Yeah. That is not a good standard. There is really no standard. Compostable is okay. So the idea with poo or say, because the other thing is in York region, for example, they require people to put compostable bags in their green bin liners, right? In the city of Toronto, they say, don't do that, use plastic bags. It's all a bit confusing. But in York region, you're supposed to use those compostable bags. in that case, those compostable bags are being sent through an industrial composter. And, you know, I believe there will be some microplastic pollution that comes out of the bottom of that. I believe there's probably already microplastic pollution that comes out of our composting systems, just because there is, you know, plastic that gets in there that doesn't get out, right? So I actually haven't heard an analysis of what happens with those compostable bags in those systems. I'm assuming most of them do break down. I am concerned a little bit about microplastic pollution that remains in the residues in the soils, and then where that ends up going is a bit of a concern I have. In the poo bag, so if you live in the city of Toronto, you're putting that into the garbage pail. Really what that means is, yes, it's going to go to a landfill. It may be capped in a space where it doesn't see a lot of oxygen and doesn't break down anyway. But if it does break down, both the poo and the compostable plastic will create greenhouse gases, right? I mean, that's just a reality. That's what happens with the stuff when it breaks down. So, but what won't happen is that those plastic bags won't be there for thousands of years. So there's that. I mean, I think there is a
sorry.
There is a concept now of landfill mining, which means going back in and pulling things out of landfills that can be used again, which I find really interesting. So they wait till stuff kind of degrades, and then they see what's left over, like metals and I don't know, maybe some hard plastics, maybe soft plastics. It's an interesting question then of what that stuff will look like if we go back and mine it.
Yeah. In all the off-leash parks that I go to, Toronto now does have green bins for poo, and there are actually there's now a green sign in some of the new recycling, you know, and waste canisters for poo bags. So
okay, and so what'll happen then if you're throwing it away in Toronto, I think what'll happen is they separate all the bags, whether they're compostable or not, and the bags will just go to landfill.
Yeah.
So what I've heard the city say is, don't waste your money. If the compostable bags are more expensive, don't waste your money.
Throughout this presentation, I kept thinking of that movie, The Graduate, which, if you know that brief moment when he's told that one word, I feel very guilty every time I go to the supermarket, because the only way that I can buy the fruit and vegetables is putting them in a plastic bag.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got a ton of plastic bags at home, and I don't know what to do with them other than throw them in the garbage. And so, I mean, I know that some stores like our Sobeys is using paper bags when you go to the checkout, but as an option. But it's like you said, it's so ubiquitous. And, you know, I've got, like it was somebody else asked the various products, like our body lotions and our creams and all these various containers. I mean, what do you do with them? I had a whole bag of them. I put them in the recycling, realizing that most of them are just going to end up in landfill.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering, and even if I use a compostable bag, I think they're a joke. When I try to put some of these compostable bags, they rip because they're so fragile. So I end up using a regular plastic bag. Anyway, I don't know. It's a very frustrating process, and I wish there was. I hope that our younger generation is going to carry the ball on this, because it's going to take a long time to deal with this.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Well, I think, yeah, please don't feel guilty and depressed. Like, really, this is the world we live in. We know, you know, how we got here. So we'll have to work together to get away from it. You can, you know, I sometimes bring reusable produce bags to the store, and I just have them weigh the stuff in the reusable bags. There are reusable options. Sometimes they're not as convenient, for sure. But I think we have to get used to new forms of convenience, let's just say. So I would just say, try not to feel guilty and think about, on your own, think about options you have. I'm going to tell you, we're going to do a supermarket audit because the supermarket is the most depressing place for people who hate plastic. And we really want to investigate what's happening at those supermarkets. Why do you come back home and then realize you had more plastic than you even thought? Like, oh, I thought I got a jar of pickles. It turns out it's a plastic jar. Or I thought I was getting a tin of cat food. It turns out it's a plastic tin. Like, we're even picking up more plastic than we think now because so much of the stuff that's pushed on us is packaged in plastic. So I think we're going to try to explore that. But this is not really something you have a lot of choice over at the moment. I mean, it's ubiquitous. So we really do have to, I think Henry's right, it's going to take a little while to get beyond this, but we really do have to work together to change how some of these systems work. And there are lots of small companies. We have a letter also signed about reuse that signed by like more than 80 organizations across Canada, of small organizations that are working on reuse systems and reuse options. So it is a burgeoning kind of little part of the economy that we hope to help grow for sure.
One of my small acts to use less plastic is I switched to laundry detergent strips a few years back. So there's no water, there's no plastic in the packaging. When people have to ship things around the country because there's no water, then you're also not using up as many greenhouse gases because they weigh almost nothing. They're good for pretty much all kinds of machines. And they're phosphate free, they're dioxin free. This is a brand I bought at my local health food store, Ambrosia, and it's called Nature Clean. But in the past, I've also ordered things online, and it was called, it's now called True Earth, like TRU Earth, same kind of thing. So the packaging is cardboard, and these are the strips, and and honestly, I just bend them and then I break them up and I throw them where people usually put their liquid detergent, and they work fine. And I've been using them for a couple of years now, and it's great because I'm in a condo and I have to go downstairs from a laundry perspective, so I don't have to schlep a big jug down there, or I don't have to schlep a big jug out of the grocery stores too. And they take up very little space, and in a condo, that's important as well.
Along the same line as the laundry strips, I started buying shampoo bars for my hair, and they're very small. You can get 50 shampoos out of one, and so you don't have the bottles you're lugging around or trying to get rid of. It's in a little cardboard box that you can recycle, and they're starting to have more options. Be a conditioner and a shampoo, but maybe different types for dry hair, et cetera, and that sort of thing. I got it at my local natural food store. So just something to be looking at.
Karen, I just want to thank you for a fantastic presentation today. Okay, so here we're going to make these available for everyone. These were all provided by Karen, so thank you. The Center for International Environmental Law, they have a paper that's a good primer. There's a plastics blog that we can promote for Karen that I think a lot of people are going to want to look at after today, and their Mythbuster, which she talked about some of them, but somewhere we can go and go back again. The call to action to end plastic pollution, signed by more than 50 environmental organizations and delivered to the federal government. And hopefully that's part of the legislation Karen mentioned is coming out in June. The Toronto Environmental Alliance, they're advocating for a reuse refill policy.